The high-altitude station stood exposed against the sweep of the Colorado mountains, its wooden platform scoured pale by years of wind and thin snow. In 1891, it no longer served the purpose it once had. The silver veins in the nearby hills had thinned, then vanished, and with them went the men who had filled the town with noise and expectation. What remained was a place suspended between use and abandonment, a stopping point for those who had not yet found where they belonged next. Trains still came, but less often, and when they did, they arrived quietly, as if unwilling to disturb what was already fading. Evelyn Harper stepped down onto the platform with a single carpet bag in her hand. She did not hesitate or look back toward the rail car, though the heat from the engine still brushed her coat. She stood still for a moment, letting the wind press against her dress, lifting the hem slightly, testing her balance as if the land itself were deciding whether to accept her. Her face bore the composure of someone long accustomed to restraint. She was not young, but neither was she worn in the way hardship sometimes carved people hollow. Her weariness lay deeper, beneath the skin, shaped by years of service lived quietly in other people's rooms. She had not come west chasing fortune or escape. Her reasons were simpler and heavier. There were places a person could no longer remain once they had learned certain truths about themselves. The doctor's words from 2 years earlier had ended one version of her future and left her with a silence she carried carefully, never announcing it, never defending it. She had learned to fold that knowledge into her movements, into her lack of expectation. Children had passed through her life in brief seasons, belonging to families who required her presence, but not her permanence. When those seasons ended, she moved on without protest, leaving no mark that would compel her to be remembered. The station building was small, its paint cracked and flaking, the windows clouded by dust and neglect. A handful of men waited nearby, none of them lingering long. Goods were unloaded, crates set down with efficiency but without urgency. The place operated out of habit rather than purpose. Evelyn registered these details without judgment. She had lived too long among fragile arrangements to expect solidity on arrival. Nathan Crawford stood apart from the others, his presence defined not by movement but by stillness. He arrived before the train, tethering his horse well away from the platform, choosing distance over convenience. He watched the disembarking passengers with the consideration of someone accustomed to weighing options quietly. His clothing showed signs of frequent repair rather than neglect, each patch placed with practicality rather than care for appearance. The lines in his face spoke of exposure more than age, shaped by weather and repetition rather than excess. He had not come seeking help in the conventional sense. The farmland near the pass did not lend itself to casual labor, and he had learned through hard seasons that money alone could not substitute for presence. His home required steadiness. It required someone capable of remaining when conditions tested resolve. The 3 children in his care represented different losses, gathered through circumstance rather than intention, and each had altered the shape of his life. Since his wife's death, the farm had been held together by persistence rather than confidence. He had reached a point where effort without balance threatened collapse. When Evelyn and Nathan noticed one another, it was not a moment defined by recognition, but by assessment. Each measured what stood before them, not for attraction, but for endurance. Evelyn observed the manner in which he stood, grounded against the wind, neither braced nor yielding. Nathan noted the way she held her bag with both hands, as if aware that it represented all she had chosen to bring. There was no greeting that set their meeting apart from the many others that passed unnoticed at such stations. Their connection began as an awareness, rather than an exchange. The agent directed Evelyn toward the small office where notices were pinned to the wall, most of them outdated or irrelevant. She scanned them without urgency, absorbing the limited options they suggested. Domestic work appeared among the offerings, as it always did, but most positions lay far from the rail line, isolated by terrain and weather rather than distance alone. She recognized in herself a readiness she had not felt before, a willingness to trade familiarity for risk, if risk offered the possibility of permanence. Nathan waited until the platform cleared, then approached with measured intent. He did not rush to speak, nor did he delay unnecessarily. The wind carried dust between them, indifferent to timing or outcome. What passed between them in that moment was not hope, but recognition of shared fatigue. Each had learned the cost of continuing alone. Each carried a private understanding that endurance, without relief, eventually exacted more than it returned. Evelyn listened as information was offered, weighing it not against desire, but against capability. She considered distance, elevation, isolation. She imagined winter without dramatizing it, days measured by necessity rather than comfort. The farm near the pass did not promise ease, but it did offer clarity. Committing meant stepping outside patterns she knew well, but remaining meant repeating a cycle already exhausted. She understood, with quiet certainty, that there would be no trial period. Whatever she chose would require full presence from the beginning. By the time they left the station together, daylight was shifting westward, shadows lengthening across the gravel. No formal agreement had been made, and nothing had been secured beyond intent. Yet the decision carried weight. The station receded behind them, already surrendering their footprints to the wind. Ahead lay terrain defined less by invitation than by challenge. As they set out toward the road climbing into the hills, neither looked back, neither spoke. The land closed around them gradually, and with it came the first unarticulated understanding that the choice begun there would extend beyond employment or convenience. Something unresolved had been set in motion, not by promise or longing, but by two lives pausing long enough to acknowledge the cost of continuing separately.
The farm lay far beyond the last recognizable road, where the land abandoned any pretense of welcome. Rock and scrub grass claimed the slopes, and wind moved through the pass with uninterrupted force, shaping not only the earth, but the habits of those who remained there. The buildings stood apart from one another, placed for function rather than comfort, their angles settled against prevailing currents. Nothing in the setting suggested longevity, yet everything bore the marks of having endured. Evelyn remained not because of agreement, but because the season offered no alternative. The days shortened with noticeable speed, and the first signs of winter gathered along the higher ridges, untroubled by human readiness. Leaving would have meant exposure without direction, and so she stayed with the clear-eyed understanding that necessity often preceded belonging. She brought no expectations with her into the house, only attentiveness and restraint. During the first weeks, her presence barely altered the visible routine. She rose early, moved quietly, and learned the household through observation rather than assumption. She listened to the building itself, noting how the floors responded to weight, where cold entered at night, which tools were reached for most often. She paid patience to the children, studying their patterns without pressing for affection. Each carried a different caution. One was wary, one impulsive, one withdrawn in a way that suggested long practice. Evelyn met them where they were, neither correcting nor comforting beyond what was necessary. Nathan allowed this progression without intervention. He had learned through loss that imposition often disrupted more than it repaired. He watched from a distance, gauging change slowly, accepting small adjustments without comment. The farm demanded his attention in constant measure. Livestock required care regardless of weather, and the land offered no concessions for fatigue. His trust, once given, took the form of absence rather than instruction. Gradually, the house accepted a different rhythm. Meals occurred at more consistent hours. Wet clothing dried where warmth could reach it without crowding the room. Tasks found sequence instead of urgency. Unspoken agreements settled into place, defining who rose first, who stayed last in the barn, where quiet was understood rather than enforced. The nights grew colder, and the interior of the house retained warmth longer, not only from the stove but from the steadiness of shared effort. Evelyn felt the shift before she understood it. For years her identity had been shaped by what she could not provide, by the absence that followed her from one household to another. Here, no such definition existed. The children did not approach her with expectation shaped by biology. They responded to reliability, to attention given without transaction. In caring for them, she recognized that connection formed through consistency rather than inheritance. This realization did not erase her grief, but it softened its edge, allowing space for something unplanned to emerge. The wind continued to press against the walls, indifferent to human adjustment. Snow appeared early on the higher ground, and the work of preparation intensified. Evelyn joined these efforts without ceremony, learning to measure supplies, to anticipate need, to distinguish urgency from panic. Her movements grew more assured. The house responded accordingly, no longer resisting but accommodating her presence. Nathan observed these developments quietly. He noted the children's changed sleep patterns, the reduced tension at day's end, the way tasks no longer accumulated into disorder. He recognized the change not as improvement imposed from outside, but as balance rediscovered. The farm did not feel repaired but steadied. Evenings gathered them into a shared interior without requiring conversation. Lamps were lit, tools set aside, and the sounds of the day faded into wind moving across the pass. In these moments, Evelyn sensed the formation of something neither delayed nor rushed. Each morning followed with similar consistency, building layer upon layer of routine that held without strain. By the time the first heavy snowfall arrived, the house had adjusted around them all. What existed there remained fragile, exposed to seasons and circumstance, yet it carried a weight previously absent. It was not permanence declared, but continuity practiced. In the repetition of small acts, in the absence of explanation, a form of belonging took shape, quiet and unremarkable, yet unmistakably real.
The storm arrived abruptly, the kind that turned familiar slopes into strangers overnight. Snow fell thick and heavy, masking the uneven terrain with a deceptive softness. The children had been playing near the edge of the ridge, their laughter drifting faintly before the wind swallowed it entirely. When the youngest failed to return, the weight of absence pressed down immediately, sharp and insistent. Nathan moved with silent urgency, his boots crunching over icy rocks, heart thudding with the primal fear of a parent who has no time for hesitation. Evelyn followed, her eyes scanning the whitened horizon, muscles tense, senses alert to every subtle sign. Hours stretched with a slow cruelty, each minute a test of endurance. The wind roared through the gullies, carrying the taste of frost and the scent of pine resin. Snowflakes struck like cold needles against skin exposed in fleeting moments. And yet Evelyn pressed on, steady and unyielding, driven by instinct as much as determination. The boys' tracks, faint and almost erased by the relentless snowfall, guided her through the labyrinth of rock and ice. Every step demanded focus, balance, and the quiet courage to continue despite exhaustion. She found him huddled beneath a crag, limbs trembling, his small body fragile against the vastness of the mountains.
Relief surged and mingled with a sharp edge of fear, the kind that leaves the chest tight long after danger has passed. Evelyn wrapped him in the heady coat she carried, her hands firm but gentle, drawing warmth into him as she lifted him carefully, supporting weight too small to measure against her own, but heavy with vulnerability. The journey back was a slow negotiation with gravity and snow, each movement deliberate to preserve the fragile trust now placed in her arms. Nathan met them at the edge of the trees, his expression shifting subtly from taut vigilance to recognition. The sight of Evelyn carrying the child, unshaken by the ordeal, reframed everything he had thought about her role in their lives. She was no longer simply the woman who had agreed to stay through the winter. She was now a presence whose strength had been proven, whose courage had been made manifest. The night's ordeal left a residue of shared understanding, unspoken but undeniable, that tethered their coexistence with a newfound gravity. Inside the warmth of the cabin, the boy slowly thawed, the edges of fear softening under careful hands. Evelyn tended to him with a precision that belied the tension of the past hours, every movement an act of quiet authority and care. Nathan observed, silent, absorbing the reality of her actions, the way she navigated responsibility with a calm that he had not anticipated. It was in these moments that the fragile architecture of their household solidified further. Trust, interlaced with respect. Fear, tempered by reliability. A silent acknowledgement that the bond they were forming was no longer optional or circumstantial.
As the night wore on, the snowstorm subsided, leaving a stark landscape outside and a home that felt heavier with presence and intention. Evelyn remained by the hearth, attending to blankets, checking each child, her breath steady despite the tremors of adrenaline still lingering. Nathan finally allowed himself to sit, gaze fixed on her figure silhouetted in the flickering lamplight. The air between them was quiet, yet it thrummed with the tension of lives suddenly intertwined, each aware that the stakes had shifted. The past weeks of routine had been a rehearsal for moments like this, when survival and commitment became indistinguishable, and the fragile semblance of domestic life revealed its true weight. By morning, the mountain air had cleared, leaving icicles dangling from the eaves and frost tracing delicate patterns on the windows. Inside, there was a cautious calm. The boy nestled safely among blankets, the other children still drowsy and unsettled from the storm. Nathan moved through the space with measured steps, the memory of the night etched in his posture, in the quiet gravity of his movements. Evelyn worked alongside him, side by side without words, restoring order and tending to needs that had become urgent and immediate. Yet within this work, there was a new recognition, an understanding of the depth of her presence. The night's events had transformed more than the house. The invisible lines of trust, reliance, and respect had been drawn indelibly between them. Evelyn was no longer an outsider, no longer merely a visitor in a fragile winter refuge. She was a cornerstone of the household, her place secured through courage, compassion, and decisive action. Nathan sensed this acutely, a quiet acknowledgement settling in the pit of his chest. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider not just the survival of his home, but the enduring presence of someone who had proven indispensable. The mountains outside remained harsh and indifferent, but within the walls of the cabin, a fragile, hard-won stability had taken root, anchored by the shared trials of the storm. The storm left behind silence, sharp and complete, and yet within that silence was a heartbeat of possibility.
Nathan and Evelyn moved through the house with an awareness that had not existed before, a sense of interdependence that neither could ignore. The children, sensing the shift without understanding its mechanics, watched and absorbed, their small bodies adjusting to the newfound order. In the quiet aftermath, the cabin felt alive in a different way, no longer merely a shelter, but a space made resilient by the choices, courage, and care of those within. The night's crisis had carved a line of permanence, subtle yet unbreakable, that marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives together. Spring arrived on the ridge slowly, a hesitant thaw that loosened the grip of winter but left the earth uneven and uncertain. The wind carried the scent of damp soil and budding pine, mingling with the faint smoke from the cabin chimneys. Nathan moved through the yard, checking fences and water troughs, aware of the way the landscape itself pressed against him, reminding him of how fragile his household remained. Evelyn followed the routine she had learned, her hands steady, her movements deliberate. Yet the knowledge that the children's presence depended on more than effort alone weighed heavily on her. The arrival of the county representative changed the rhythm of the farm abruptly. The man rode in with clipped authority, papers in hand, his horse stamping on the dirt as though aware of the tension beneath the surface. He surveyed the property with critical eyes, cataloging the peeling paint, uneven boards, and the scattered playthings of the children. His inspection was quiet but exacting, leaving Nathan's jaw tight and hands restless. He had weathered many storms, but this intrusion brought a different kind of exposure, one that could unravel years of quiet endurance with the stroke of a pen. Evelyn observed the proceedings with a heightened awareness, noting every detail, every hesitation, every way the children's laughter faltered under the weight of scrutiny. She understood that survival here depended not on physical labor alone, but on navigating the invisible rules of law and expectation, of proving legitimacy where only care and presence had existed before. The past choices Nathan had made in isolation, the stubborn insistence on facing the world alone, now threatened the safety they had built together. Each corner of the home, each makeshift routine could be questioned, and with it, the fragile sense of permanence. She began to move with purpose, drafting petitions, gathering testimonies, recounting every act that had bound the children to this home. She approached neighbors quietly at first, then with increasing confidence, sharing the truth of their lives, the stability that Nathan provided, and the love she now offered. Each signature, each acknowledgement was a small victory, a counterweight to the looming threat. Evelyn's presence shifted the balance. She acted not as a visitor or temporary caretaker, but as a guardian whose conviction carried the authority of those who had chosen to witness and affirm. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was taut with anticipation. The children sensed the seriousness, their small bodies mirroring the tension of the adults, their routines faltering under the weight of possibility. Nathan moved through the space, careful not to disrupt the delicate balance Evelyn had begun to weave, aware that every gesture, every decision now had consequences beyond immediate comfort or survival. The quiet order of the house became a battlefield of endurance, resilience, and courage, each moment measured against the potential of loss. Evelyn's resolve grew with each day. She risked judgment, the exposure of her own vulnerabilities, and the possibility that her efforts could fail, leaving her without home or purpose once again. Yet in the act of openness, of calling upon the wider community, she found a quiet power that had been absent in her life before. Her actions were precise, deliberate, and patient, weaving together threads of trust, recognition, and proof that this home was not a temporary refuge, but a sanctuary forged by dedication, love, and shared responsibility. The pressure from the outside world pressed on, tangible and relentless, yet it revealed the strength that had quietly grown within the household. Nathan began to recognize the depth of Evelyn's courage, the way her determination illuminated the spaces he had always filled with stoic labor alone. Her advocacy did more than protect the children. It altered the way he perceived himself, not merely as a caretaker managing tasks, but as a man whose home could sustain life, love, and law together. As days passed, documents were filed, neighbors spoke in support, and each piece of evidence added weight to their claim. Evelyn moved among the children, guiding them gently, maintaining routines while preparing them for the uncertainty that hung over every meal, every chore, every quiet evening by the hearth. Nathan watched her, silent, noticing the careful way she balanced kindness with authority, awareness with decisiveness. The house, once simply a shelter against the wind, became a fortress of proof, evidence, and trust, held together by hands that would not falter. The tension did not dissipate, but within it emerged clarity. The household could no longer be defined solely by survival. It had become a testament to choice, courage, and commitment. Evelyn's efforts, combined with Nathan's steadfast presence, created an undeniable truth that extended beyond law or precedent, that family could exist not only through blood, but through devotion, persistence, and unwavering care. Every signature gathered, every testimony given, every act of daily life became part of the mosaic they were building, each fragment asserting their right to remain together. By the time the county representative prepared to make his report, the house exuded a quiet strength. It was no longer merely the sum of individuals enduring winter and snow, but a living structure sustained by recognition, trust, and proof of care. The children moved freely, their laughter gradually returning, a barometer of the stability Evelyn had fought to preserve. Nathan allowed himself moments of cautious hope, acknowledging silently the transformation that had taken place. The risk of exposure and the confrontation with authority had brought them closer, revealing the resilience and courage that lay beneath the surface of daily life. The days stretched into weeks, each one marked by quiet preparation, careful negotiation, and the slow accumulation of validation. Evelyn remained vigilant, precise, and unwavering, her presence now inseparable from the household itself. Nathan's respect for her deepened with every passing challenge, a recognition that her willingness to stand in the open, to risk everything for the security of the children, had reshaped the home in ways that labor alone could never achieve. The outside world had pressed in, relentless and judging, and in response, Evelyn had expanded the boundaries of their sanctuary, proving that commitment, love, and courage could withstand scrutiny. By the end of spring, the threat of removal still lingered in quiet corners of Nathan's mind, yet the home had been irrevocably transformed. The household moved with newfound rhythm, the children secure, and the adults aware of the power that transparency, courage, and relentless care could command. The pressure of the world had forced them to confront their fears, articulate their commitment, and assert their bond openly. In doing so, Evelyn and Nathan had woven a foundation that no external force could easily unsettle. their household no longer defined merely by the past, but by the choices and devotion that would carry it forward into uncertain seasons ahead.
The night settled over the mountains, with a weight that pressed into the valleys and crevices, a silence so dense it seemed almost physical. Snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier, the flakes thickening the air and cloaking the slopes in white. Evelyn moved among the children inside the cabin, her hands constantly busy with small tasks to keep fear at bay. She stoked the fire, checked the latches on the doors and windows, and smoothed blankets over the children's shoulders. Each movement deliberate, a quiet rhythm meant to reassure both herself and those in her care. Outside, the mountains shifted. A distant groan echoed through the ridges, subtle at first, then growing, carrying the unmistakable sound of stone and earth giving way. Nathan had ridden through the pass hours before, his figure swallowed by the storm, and the thought of him out there alone gnawed at Evelyn. She felt the weight of helplessness, a tangible tension pressing against her chest, the kind that made her fingers tremble even as she went about the necessary tasks. Every gust of wind seemed louder, every crack of ice sharper. The children clung close, their small bodies pressing against her as if proximity alone could ward off disaster. Evelyn's mind worked furiously, sorting through possibilities, calculating the hours, imagining what might have happened on that pass. She moved among them like a tether, holding together the fragile strands of safety she could offer. Each footstep on the worn wooden floors, each adjustment of a pillow or blanket, each quiet hum meant to soothe carried the weight of determination, an assertion that no matter the danger outside, this space would remain a sanctuary. Hours passed in a blur of anxious routine. Evelyn rationed the firewood, prepared simple meals, and guided the children through quiet games to distract them from the wind's roar and the mountains moaning. Her body ached from constant vigilance, but she forced herself to remain present, to keep panic in check. The storm was merciless, a reminder that the world beyond their walls was unpredictable and often cruel. Yet in that night, a clarity emerged. She was no longer merely an observer of life. She was the anchor of it. As the night deepened, shadows from the fire flickered across the walls, tracing shapes of worry and exhaustion on every face. The children's breaths were uneven, alternating between sleep and wakefulness, the occasional whimper or reminder of their dependence on her steadiness. Evelyn moved among them, her own fear tempered by the necessity of composure. Every sound from outside, the crack of ice, the shifting of snow, the distant tumble of rock, was catalogued, measured, endured. The dawn broke slowly, painting the sky in pale shades of rose and gray. Evelyn had long since to keep track of hours. Only the approach of light offered the first relief. And then she saw him, staggering through the thinning snow, clothes torn and bloodied, but alive. Nathan's presence was a shock to the system, a rush of relief that threatened to overwhelm the careful control she had maintained all night. She ran to meet him, guiding him inside, helping him shed the wet layers and tend to his injuries. The children stirred at the commotion, curiosity overcoming fear as they saw their father returned. Evelyn moved among them with quiet authority, reassuring them without words, her gaze shifting constantly between Nathan and the children. The cabin, once filled with anxiety and tension, now breathed with cautious relief. Every small movement, from stoking the fire to settling blankets, was suffused with gratitude and exhaustion, the cumulative weight of the night settling into a shared understanding. They had endured together.
Monotonous, with a slight rasp, like a tale by the campfire. Nathan leaned on the hearth, his body heavy with fatigue and bruises, yet the relief in his eyes spoke of the bond that had strengthened through adversity. Evelyn stood near him, her own exhaustion mirrored in the lines of her face, but beneath it lay a hardened certainty. The night had tested them, had threatened to undo everything they had built, yet it had only made the foundation stronger. Every fear confronted, every small victory of survival had woven them closer. The storm's echo remained in the mountains, but within the cabin, calm returned. The children resumed their tentative routines. The fire crackled, and the air carried a fragile warmth that had been absent hours before. Evelyn's hands lingered briefly on Nathan's arm, a silent acknowledgement of survival, of partnership, of the unspoken bond forged through shared peril. No words were necessary. The night had said everything that needed to be understood. By mid-morning, the first tangible signs of return to normalcy appeared. Nathan moved among the children, assessing and correcting minor injuries, checking the stability of the cabin, and beginning the work of restoring order. Evelyn observed, helping when necessary, sharing the responsibility without comment. The fear that had gripped her through the night no longer held sway. It had been replaced by a quiet certainty that together they could withstand the worst the mountains and the world might throw at them. The night through the pass had become a turning point. It stripped away lingering doubt, solidifying the partnership between Nathan and Evelyn, affirming that their connection was more than circumstance. Each decision, each act of care had been witnessed and endured, leaving no room for hesitation. They were no longer two people managing a household. They were a unit forged by necessity, courage, and unspoken trust. In the hours that followed, as snow continued to drift lightly outside and the wind softened to a mere whisper, the cabin exhaled the tension of the past night. Evelyn moved among the children, checking blankets, offering quiet reassurances, allowing them to sense that all was well. Nathan, steady yet marked by the ordeal, observed her with a gaze that carried newfound recognition and gratitude. The night had passed, the danger survived, and with it their understanding of what truly mattered had been irrevocably strengthened. From this moment forward, doubt held no dominion over their lives. Every risk endured, every fear faced together, had created a shared resilience that would guide them through the uncertain seasons ahead. The mountains remained wild beyond the walls of the cabin, but within, a certainty had taken root. What was built by care, courage, and steadfast presence could not easily be undone. Evelyn and Nathan, together, had claimed not only survival, but the unspoken promise of enduring trust, and the family they had become would carry the strength of that night forward into the days to come.
Summer arrived slowly in the high Colorado mountains, lingering snow clinging stubbornly to shaded slopes, while the air grew warm enough to carry the scent of thawing earth and pine. The farm had weathered another season, the struggles of winter and spring etched into the worn wood of the cabin and the well-trodden paths across the property. The county's decision had come quietly, affirming the family's right to remain together, and with it came a release of tension that had haunted the household for months. There were no announcements, no celebration, only a quiet acknowledgement that the house was no longer vulnerable, that what they had built could endure. The wedding was not planned in the way townspeople might imagine. There were no invitations, no flowers, no music spilling into the air. There was only the necessity of formalizing a bond that had already been forged through months of shared labor, fear, and careful attention to one another. Evelyn and Nathan left the farm in the late morning, traveling down the dusty road toward the nearest settlement, the children remaining behind in the care of a trusted neighbor who had become a part of their unspoken network of support. The rhythm of the journey itself was calm, the landscape stretching wide and quiet, the mountains casting long shadows over the wagon wheels as the dust rose and settled around them. The church they arrived at was small and unassuming, a building that had stood through decades of wind, snow, and sun without complaint. Inside, the wooden pews bore the marks of countless visits, their surfaces polished by generations of hands, the windows uneven and smudged, filtering light in gentle, unpredictable patterns.
There were no witnesses beyond a few sparse parishioners whose presence was more habit than interest. Evelyn moved among the pews with the same deliberate care she had shown in the cabin, her steps steady, her posture unassuming, carrying with her the quiet strength that had grown through the winter months. Nathan's presence beside her was equally unremarkable to anyone who did not know him, yet to Evelyn it conveyed all the certitude and commitment that words could never capture. The officiation was swift, almost procedural. There were no speeches, no proclamations, no declarations beyond what was required by law. Their hands were joined, the formalities observed, but it was clear that the bond being recognized had long existed. Every challenge they had faced together, the storms, the threats of separation, the nights of fear, had already confirmed what this moment merely acknowledged. The ceremony ended as quickly as it began, leaving them standing quietly in the center of the church, the light shifting across the floorboards, casting long, uneven patterns that mirrored the life they had built, imperfect, unassuming, but undeniably solid.
The day unfolded into evening with a gentle serenity. The children's energy waned as chores were completed and the light softened across the slopes. Evelyn folded the last of the laundry, letting it flutter in the breeze, feeling the warmth on her hands and the satisfaction of order and care. Nathan surveyed the corral, his work complete, the lines of responsibility shared yet distinct. In their silence and in their movements, there was a profound acknowledgement that life continued, constant and steady, shaped by choices, fear, courage, and shared effort. This was the reality they had chosen, a life of quiet commitment and mutual support, a home built on resilience rather than ceremony, on shared trials rather than fleeting celebration. The wedding had been the final step in formalizing what had already existed for months, a confirmation rather than a revelation. The mountains remained vast and indifferent, the wind still cutting through the passes. But within the boundaries of the farm, everything rested on a foundation both hard-earned and enduring. Evelyn and Nathan moved among the children and chores, their partnership unspoken yet fully realized, the farm itself a testament to what had been survived, preserved, and chosen. If you are drawn to stories of quiet strength, enduring love, and choices made in the spaces between words, subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales. Here we share the kind of love that grows in silence, in perseverance, and in the steady rhythm of life lived together.